Colonel Myers here again. I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about the Moore family Bowie knife, or the Bart Moore Bowie knife. We'll talk about the historical knife first, and then we'll talk about this reproduction. The historical knife, been some controversy. At least two experts, Bernard Levine, who's a consultant to the Smithsonian, and William Williamson, both contest the story of the Moore family's Bowie knife being the original Jim Bowie knife. Some people support it, some people oppose it. The story goes that John Moore was the sheriff near Wichita Falls, Texas in the late 1800s. And he knew a man that was an old man, a Mexican farmer that had been in the area for decades. And this Mexican farmer owed the Moore family like $5 as a debt. And in order to repay the debt, he gave John Moore a Bowie knife that he said was taken at the Alamo. The man's story was, and again, this was late 1880s, early 1890s. He would have been an old man. So he claimed that he was at the Battle of the Alamo in the 1830s, and he was a young man in Santa Anna's army. And that the next day after the Battle of the Alamo, he found this knife near one of the funeral pyres, and he claimed it and had kept it, and that this was Jim Bowie's original knife that he had at the Alamo. So the Moore family took the knife, and supposedly it was stored away in some barn for a couple of generations until the 1980s, when there became an increased interest in the history at the Alamo and the Bowie knives. And then it came forth that, hey, we have the original knife owned by Jim Bowie. They had sent it out for testing, although haven't ever been able to find out what testing was done and how valid it was, but supposedly the knife disappeared at that point, and they had to get the FBI involved to help recover the knife and bring it back to the family. In 1990, Bart Moore wanted $3.5 million for the knife, claiming it was that valuable. I don't think he ever got anybody willing to pay that. But let's just talk about the historical aspect. There's an etching on the knife that says J. Bowie. It looks more like it was scratched in than truly etched. And there is an emblem on here that was claimed to be James Black's emblem. That this was a knife made by the Arkansas blacksmith James Black for Jim Bowie. Well, there's problems with that. Now, I'm willing to concede that the old man's story rings true. He could have really embellished it and said he was one of the guys that charged in and found Jim Bowie in his room and fought him and killed him, and he claimed the knife as a prize. He didn't go into that kind of detail. He simply seems to have said that he found this near a funeral pyre, which kind of makes sense because after the Battle of the Alamo, all of the bodies were kind of stripped, piled in a huge pile, and set on fire. Santa Anna's army is known to have confiscated any of the military weapons, so any of the long guns, things like that, would have been gone, but personal sidearms weren't taken and were left as plunder. And so as these bodies were being stripped, things that were on the bodies likely got tossed aside into a pile. So somebody rummaging through the pile would come up and, oh, look at this cool knife, I'm going to keep that. Okay, so I'm willing to concede that it very well may have been a knife taken at the Alamo. Supposedly the testing that was done by the Moore family dated it to the 1830s, which would make sense. Now, whether it's made by James Black, whether it was actually carried by Jim Bowie, that's going to be hard to prove. This little scratched in that says J. Bowie could have easily been scratched in by somebody after the fact, trying to give more value to the knife. I doubt very seriously it was made by James Black. Collectors do have a handful of knives that are pretty faithfully attributed to James Black. They look nothing like this. And James Black never used a mark on any of his blades, a maker's mark. It was said that James Black trained under a silver plater in Philadelphia at one point, and that one of the things he did for his knives was he had silver plating on them at some point to make them more valuable, more desirable, more expensive. No silver plating on this knife. All of the known James Black knives, no crossguard. Obviously this one has a very specialized crossguard. All of the knives attributed to James Black have kind of a squared off coffin hilt. Very different from this knife. So I don't think this was made by James Black. This crest that they're attributing to James Black also seems to be kind of etched in or scratched in. You can't really see it on the knife. So I've kind of drawn it. They try to say that that is a JB for James Black and an acorn because he had a big oak tree outside of his workshop. I don't know if that's true or not, but it would be very unusual. As far as I know, that maker's mark has never shown up on any other knives. So I doubt whether this was made by James Black, whether it was carried by Jim Bowie. We like to think so, but the one point I'm willing to concede is that it may have been taken at the Alamo. Could have been carried by anybody though. So now the attributes of the knife itself. People have said that it had been probably originally about 10 inches and had broken at some point and been reground. And just using the knife, it has the feel like it should be longer. It should be a bigger knife. So I would like to see it bigger. Now, one little thread you can find says that the testing they did showed it was Damascus steel. I kind of question that it's truly Damascus steel. It has cuttings on the back, the spine of the blade, like file cuttings. So some have said the blade was originally made from a file. Maybe, maybe not. I would think in the process of grinding everything, they would have ground off these teeth, but maybe whoever made it originally left it decoratively. It's a very specialized guard, and so I'll show you some of the attributes that makes me believe that maybe somebody actually knew what they were doing and put those serrations in there on purpose. Okay. Others have said the styling is very much like typical Mexican Bowies, which again would bring in the whole idea that James Black made it. It has kind of a round handle, almost like a broomstick, but the fittings have a shoulder on them. So round handle for a fighting knife is not good because it turns in your hand, and as you're moving it, you're never quite sure where to index it without looking at it to know that your edge is in alignment. So you like having a blade that's more flat, more squared off like a coffin hilt, because then when you're holding it, you have good reference in your hand. Well, this one's round, but you at least have these shoulders on the fittings where you can put your thumb and you can tell as you move to one to the other shoulder on the fitting and get an idea of your edge orientation without having to look down at the knife. So that roundness is kind of overcome by the way they did the fittings. Although I prefer more of a flatter handle. For me, I figure I have about an average size hand, and this feels a little bit big to me. I don't feel like I get a good grip. It's not as maneuverable. So I don't particularly like the way the handle is done on this knife as part of the design, but there you go. Now, this is a very specialized guard that curves up. You don't seem to see that very often. It even hooks back. And no doubt, this was the inspiration for Bill Bagwell's design of the Hell's Bell Bowie. And you can see that curved forward guard. All right? Now, this is considered a finger choil, which allows somebody to reach forward and look at, like if you're using your knife for finer, like skinning an animal or doing stuff, it gives you a little finer control over the point. Makes sense. But when you combine that finger choil with this guard that curves upward, what this provides you with is if you are engaging someone and their knife slides down, it allows you to hook and trap their knife pretty easily. And you can see how the way this guard's designed, it'll catch with that edge right there, and you can rip a blade out of someone's hand. So there you're faced off, this blade is coming in, it either gets caught this way or it gets caught in the finger choil this way. So it's a trapping guard. Now the serrations in the back, same way, the blade came down and lodged on this side, and I go here, it gets caught in the serrations and against the guard. So again, it can get trapped this way, or if I'm going back, right, if it comes down, it catches it from this angle, it gets caught in those serrations. You wouldn't need serrations all the way out to here. You only need them to about here. But again, there's probably some kind of decorative idea involved. Or maybe it is the teeth left from a file. But regardless, combine it with this forward curving guard, and it had a purpose. It's a trapping feature, just like the trapping feature on this side. This blade, as the clip point comes down, also has, I don't know if it shows up very well, but these little shoulders. It's not just a smooth transition into the back. There's actually a little shoulder here. The idea here, and if I'm faced off with someone, point forward, and the blade is sliding, and we engage, and their blade is sliding down, it'll catch on that shoulder. So one more opportunity to deflect their blade. It won't just come up and at me. There's an opportunity it'll get caught right there on that little shoulder. You can see that. So there seems to be some thought that went into this design in the 1830s, thought by somebody that was involved in actually using a knife in structured fighting and not just free-for-all fighting. So I like it. The only thing I'd change for me would be the handle, and I like to see it a little longer. Now, this knife in particular was Franklin Mint's reproduction. Okay, Franklin Mint came out with this knife on the 150th anniversary of the Battle of the Alamo in November of 1986. It originally sold for $295, and it came in a nice oak wooden display case with glass on the front, a knife mounted in the back, a nice little plaque that said Jim Bowie knife. Okay. Supposedly, the Moore family let someone from the Franklin Mint see the original knife and handle it and take pictures of it and measure it and make dimensions, and they produce a reproduction. And examining photos of the Bart Moore Bowie knife, they did a pretty faithful, pretty good reproduction from what I can tell, because now on computers you can blow things up to the same size. The proportions are perfect. The length and width of the blade, the shape and contour of the guard, everything matches the original knife. And you can see they even they etched the Jim Bowie on the side. The only difference is they've centered it a little bit better, so it's aesthetically pleasing. I think on the original, the lettering is set up a little higher. Another difference, and where Franklin Mint seems to have fudged a little bit, this crossguard, I don't know if you can tell by looking at it, but it's very blocky. They didn't round off the edges very well, right? On the original, and as you would expect on a handmade, hand-forged knife, it's not perfectly blocked out like this one probably cut out with a CNC machine. They didn't smooth off these edges, right? So when you're using this and maneuvering up against my finger, and it cuts in and rubs pretty much. It's uncomfortable because nobody bothered to round that off. The blade is said to be high chromium stainless steel. So it's got a nice, beautiful mirror finish. So they clearly intended this as a display knife, not as a using knife. It's not sharpened, and probably with high chromium steel, it's not going to rust ever because it's a display knife, but it's probably questionable how well it would take and keep an edge. So again, made for collectors, made for display, but it's nice, solid knife. I'm sure the weight and balance is probably very similar to the original. Like I said, Franklin Mint originally sold these for $295. It was probably only a feature of their catalog for a few years. Now, I did some checking and I saw it showing up on several auction sites and several times on eBay, and it typically sells for about $150. So you can still find these, about $150. I got lucky. I bought this one for $50 plus shipping. So I was very happy with what I got for $50. But I got it for that price because the oak display case was pretty much trashed. I didn't care anything about the display case anyway. I just wanted the knife. So pretty good investment for $50. It really gives you that sense of nostalgia, thinking that this is probably truly was a Bowie knife design from the 1830s. I'm thinking probably was likely, based on the story, at the Alamo. Whether it was actually Jim Bowie's knife or not, maybe, maybe not. Made by James Black, very likely not, but still a very nice knife to have. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure and check out my Facebook page. Just search for Bowie Knife Connection and watch it there, because I will attach some other videos. Like John Fitzen did some commentary on the knife and gave his input. I'll attach that. This knife was on, or the original knife was on display at the Historic Arkansas Museum in Little Rock, Arkansas up until 2014. and I can post some footage of from someone that was there and actually filmed it in the case, where you get a little better look at it than you do from just the photos. So again, check the Facebook page, because it's much easier to attach things like that to the Facebook post and to carry on a discussion there than it is on YouTube. But hope you enjoyed my overview of the Moore family Bowie knife.